behalf of the New York Encounter, I would like to welcome Donna Freitas and Christian Smith. Donna Freitas lectures at universities across the United States on her work about college students. Over the years, she has written for national newspapers and magazines, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and the Washington Post. She received her PhD in religion from Catholic University, and she's currently a non-resident research associate at the Center for Religion and Society at Notre Dame. Dr. Freitas has been a professor at Boston University in the Department of Religion and also at Hofstra University in their Honors College. She has written children's novels for Scholastic, HarperCollins, and FSG. In 2008, Dr. Freitas published Sex and the Soul, Juggling Sexuality, Spirituality, Romance, and Religion on America's college campuses with Oxford University Press, based on her national study about how sex and faith coincide and collide in the lives of college students. Currently, she is at the tail end of collecting research for a new study about social media and how it is affecting the ways we construct identity and sense of self, how we make meaning in the world and navigate our relationships. In 2014, Dr. Freitas conducted nearly 200 in-person interviews with college students in 13 different colleges and universities about these subjects. Christian Smith is the William K. Keenan Jr. Professor of Sociology and Director of the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Smith's research focuses primarily on religion in modernity, adolescence, American evangelicalism, and culture. Dr. Smith received his MA and PhD from Harvard University in 1990 and his BA from Gordon College in 1983. He was professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill for 12 years before his move to Notre Dame. Dr. Smith's more recent work on the religious and spiritual lives of U.S. adolescents emphasizes the interplay of broad cultural influences, family socialization, and religious motivations informing teenagers' life outcomes. Behind and contributing to these sociological emphases are the philosophical works of Charles Taylor and Alistair McIntyre, a critical realist philosophy of social science, and an interpretive hermeneutical understanding of sociology. So we'd like to welcome both our speakers today as they discuss the search for the human face online, a conversation on how social networks and virtual communities affect the human identity. Welcome again.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for coming out. We're honored by your interest in what we have to say and hope what we have to say is useful and interesting for what you're doing in your lives. So the digital revolution, the internet, and social media, we all know, have transformed social and cultural life in the last 20 years. A lot of things have changed. The question we want to address now here is, how may this revolution be transforming our senses of ourselves as human beings, as human persons? How may this revolution be transforming our relationships? How might it maybe even changing the way our young people who are growing up, their brains are being wired? The question is, or some of the questions are social media pernicious? Are they harmful? Is there something we should be worried about? Are social media benign? Is it really not that big of a deal? Or is the situation more ambiguous or complicated with a mixture of kinds of influences going on? A deeper question that's more theoretical is any technology only as good as its users? That is, the technology is fairly neutral. What matters are the people who are putting the technology to use. So how good a technology is or bad is determined essentially by its users. Or does technology form its users? Are people formed by the technologies they use? Do technologies shape people, who they are, what they aspire to, the kind of character they have, and so on? That's an underlying question about the power of technology in human existence. So just at a very practical starting point level, very many of us worry when we see things like the following: 5 people hanging out at the beach or at a restaurant all together, each one of them on an iPhone interacting with somebody else who's not there, and all those 5 people are ignoring each other. That happens commonly, and it's not the end of the world, but it oftentimes troubles us. It troubles me. Some of us are worried when we see some of the nastiness of discourse online, some of the comments that people leave that seem to be made possible by the fact that it's very impersonal. People don't have to face each other face to face, and they can say vicious things sometimes. People like me, college professors, worry when we see students who seem literally unable to sit through one class without checking Facebook on their laptop or checking what texts are in on their iPhones. But the question is the digital revolution ultimately a good development? Is this something we should celebrate and be happy with that just happens to have some annoying features? Or is it somehow more ominous and destructive than that? The 20th century Jewish personalist philosopher Martin Buber said famously, "All real living is meeting. All real living is meeting." That is, all authentic life is a kind of an intimate encounter between an I and a thou, not between I and its. So if we take Buber and say, yeah, all real living is meeting, then the question is, do differences in the forms, that is the technologies of meeting, of communication, change or maybe distort or perhaps enhance human identities, human selves, human nature, human living? And if they do any of those, how do they do it and why do they do it? Now, my view is that we are in the middle, probably at the early stages of this digital revolution, how it will play out, what it will mean, and it's probably too early to say definitively what its effects are on us and will be on us. So I tend to be tentative with all of these things. Still, I think we all know it's important to pay attention to these matters because they're profound, to raise questions, to be aware of possible problems, to think about how, if nothing else, how to use technology for human flourishing rather than the distortion of human persons and human relationships. Now, I go back and forth between alarmism and feeling okay. And that tells me that I think for myself, I suggest that our default position should probably be where to start, maybe not where to end up, but where to start should be to avoid both alarmism and complacency. Maybe we should be very alarmed, and maybe by the time we're all a lot older, we'll look back and say, why weren't we a lot more alarmed? Why didn't we, raise red flags all over the place more than we did? But I don't know that we can say that now. Maybe things are more okay than that. But I suggest we should not begin at the extremes. I also find it helpful in my own mind to remember historically that most significant technological developments or innovations in modern history were met with strong initial criticisms about how harmful they should be, things that we take for granted now or that are obsolete when they first came out, whether it was the factory system or railroads or automobiles or subways or radios or televisions when they first came out. There was all sorts of alarm about how this would disrupt human life and make things work for the worse. Now, some of those criticisms in the day were actually probably correct, and we just simply have adjusted to those harms. But humans have also, I think, have a profoundly stable nature that can adapt pretty well to environmental changes with our robust humanity intact. So you can see, I'm actually having multiple minds about all this. I haven't settled in my own mind what I think about this. At the same time, however, I do, and many people do have real concerns. For one thing, the larger context of modernity, various forces and ideologies in modernity already seriously question the very idea of a real, stable, substantive human personhood. Is there even such thing as a human person? There are a lot of forces that at work now and ideologies that call that into question. And even if these forces and ideas are false, they can be destructive when they're taken seriously. So the question we want to address here is, do social media, as the focus, contribute to in some sense or not, the erosion of a thick sense of our human personhood or of the quality of our relationships? Do social media enhance or corrode human well-being? Well, to be clear, Our goal here is not to answer all the questions, but just to raise questions, to explore possible concerns, to lay out ideas of what social ideas may be doing to and among us, so that then we can all carry on these important reflections and conversations together. So my partner here, Donna Freitas, has been doing some fascinating social research on this very topic with college students, and I'm going to bounce the ball over to her and ask if she would share some of her research and her reflections and findings from that with us.
Well, so in the vein of not answering any questions, I'm going to present you with some data that you can chew on a little bit today that has to do with how college students are interacting with social media. What role does it have in their lives and their self-understanding and their relationships? And so I want to mention briefly why I started doing this research. So for the last year or so, I've been traveling around to 13 different colleges and universities in the US, Catholic, evangelical, private secular, and public universities. So different kinds of universities all over the map. Sitting down and talking to college students about social media in their lives. And the reason why I decided to do this research was because of an earlier study that I did on sex and faith on college campuses. And because of that research, I spend a lot of time talking to college students all over the US. I visit their campuses, and I usually give a lecture, and I end up in conversations with them afterwards or during dinner, and or just in the Q&A following my lectures. And one of the things that had happened in the last couple of years was I always get all kinds of interesting questions from students. And that's how I know what they were thinking about, what's really interesting to them, and then starting probably around 2010, but in particular in 2013, I felt like everywhere I went, every student I spoke with, wanted to know, and what about social media? How is that affecting what people think? What do you think other college students think about social media and how we have relationships or don't? And so I would get these very frenzied questions from college students. And so finally I decided, okay, I'm like, clearly students want to know about each other. They want to know what people are thinking. So that's why I did this research. It grew out of this other research. So given the topic of the conference, I thought I would start with just the idea of the self. One of the things that I was curious about was, so where does social media, all those things you put up on Facebook and Twitter, like, what does it have to do with you? Like, how does it integrated or not into your self-understanding? And so at the beginning of the interview, I asked every single student that I've interviewed so far, tell me about, like, what do you think the self is? I just literally said, well, tell me what you think the self is. Like, what makes up the self? And then I asked, well, what makes up yourself? What makes you you? And this was before we get into any social media questions. And I did that early on because I wanted to know if any of the students would say in their answer, unprompted, well, my Facebook profile is a huge part of who I am. And what was really interesting to me was only one student out of 175 so far said that. And so I had to push them later on and be like, well, where does Facebook fit? Or where do all your online profiles that you mentioned earlier on when I asked you, what online profiles are you committed to? That's when they would have to think about it. So first off, college students don't seem to think about Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat and all that stuff they're on all the time as a fundamental part of what makes them who they are, which I thought was really interesting. There were some students too, I asked them, so where do you think it is? Is it like out there in space? Like how do you relate to this part of who you are? And they, a lot of them think of it as very other. When they're thinking about who they are at their core, they don't seem to incorporate their different profiles. And then I thought I would mention the selfie, since we're searching for the human face, and right, the selfie is like an entire. We've got so many human faces everywhere. In fact, just before we started, I noticed 2 young women taking a selfie outside the bathroom, and I remember thinking, like, what is it about this bathroom that requires a selfie? No offense if you're in the audience, but I did wonder that. So they were capturing a really wonderful moment, perhaps, in their friendship, and it just happened there. So anyway, and then this year too, when you're walking around New York, have you seen the selfie sticks? Now we have even more ways to amplify our selfies. You know, the stick where you put your phone at the end. I see people sometimes, I live down by the river in Brooklyn, and I have seen so many people, I can't tell you how many, with the like stick out over the river trying to take a picture, and I think that's not a good idea. So anyway, I asked all the students who've participated so far, so what do you think of selfies? And I'd say about half of them will say right off the bat, I hate selfies, like they're so ridiculous, people shouldn't take selfies. And then they'll say, but I only take like 7 or 8 a day. So even students who sort of stand against selfies also are participating in selfie culture, I guess you could call it. And a lot of them will, roll their eyes about it, and the ones who do like it are very sheepish. They sort of know that they probably shouldn't, or that they should be embarrassed about it, but then they'll gush about how much they love it. And, students will talk about how, it's really hard to take a good selfie. Some of them spend a long time. They will take 40 to 50 pictures at a time. To come up with just the one that they think is worth putting somewhere. A lot of the students I spoke with have rules about selfies. So they'll talk about how, like, I don't selfie more than 2 to 3 times a week. Like, you shouldn't do it every day. Like, I hate those people who put up a selfie of themselves every day. Like, I don't need to see you eating your hamburger. And but then they'll be like, I only do it twice a week, or I only do it 3 times a week. So they've come up with structures for what is acceptable and what isn't, and they follow those rules. But a lot of them talk about how selfies are a lot of work because getting them just right is complicated. And when they do, after their 40 or 50 tries, or 35, or I feel like I heard 40 to 50 is sort of like an average. A lot of students will be like, you take like 40 to 50 pictures, and I'm like, you do? And then you find the right one, and you try it out on a profile, whether that's on Instagram or Facebook. I can already tell you that like Facebook is over. Facebook is just where you put your graduation pictures, and really it's all about Instagram. And so really Facebook is for your grandparents, according to most of the students. So they feel very obliged to post on Facebook. For the most part, they're currently enjoying Instagram and some other apps. But so you put the picture up, and then you wait and you see if the public confirms that it is truly a good selfie. And the way that you learn that is by how many likes you get. And in the discussions about likes and selfies and how many you get, I learned about high traffic times. Does anybody know about high traffic times? And the first time I heard about high traffic times, I thought, what? Like, I can guess what that is, but tell me. And so students all over the place will talk about how it's really important on a college campus that you post that face, your face, that beautiful picture you took, right around between the hours of 4 and 5 o'clock, or about between 7 and 9 p.m., because that's when everybody's checking. Don't you post that selfie at 7 a.m., because no one's on there and it's going to get lost. And so students will strategically decide to post at 4 so they can maximize their likes. And they feel very dejected. They often have a number they're going for, like I want 30 likes or 80 likes or 120 likes. Some people have very high like aspirations. And if they don't, if their new picture doesn't get that certain amount of photos, that's how they know to take it down and try again. So I want to say, so next I want to move on to one of the most surprising things I learned about social media so far that I just wasn't expecting at all when I did the study. And that is the importance of it appearing happy at all times. And so one of the things that's happened in our culture, particularly with young people, is they feel like it is very important to literally put on a happy face always when you're online, to always only post positive things, never post anything negative, even something like, today I had a bad day. And where students are learning this is from their parents, from their teachers too, because we have left the phase of social media where people are, putting up those drunk pictures and things, or pictures smoking marijuana, or pictures doing all kinds of things that you're not supposed to, even illegal things, because all of the young people that I spoke to had very much been educated into the notion that you are being watched at all time by people who will affect your future. And that means that you better watch it. Like, you have to make sure that you are doing the right thing online, that you are always saying the right thing, because your future employer may be looking at you. And if you say something that offends that person, then that's it for you. Or if you do something, if you take a picture that gets out there that is unflattering to you, then your whole future could be gone. And so there was this sense of, I must always be happy. And so students talked about the pressure to appear happy at all times. And there was a resentment about it too, because they don't feel like, and they know this about their friends, they feel like nobody's being authentic online. Everyone is always just putting on this happy face, and I don't really buy it, but I've also got to do it too. And so this idea of that we must aspire to a kind of perfection in our profiles is a big deal right now for college students. So high stakes posting is because of their profiles are very, very high stakes. Everything is very high stakes for them. And I wanted to mention, too, most students, except in very specific circumstances, will tell you that you should never post about top politics and you should never post about religion, because those are the two things that most likely will offend your future employers. And they feel like one comment, one political remark or one religious remark could mean the difference between them getting a job and the other person who they're competing against who didn't say anything about their religion or politics, with regard to their employer. So they're very, very careful. And I also want to mention one student in particular. He told me he was an aspiring politician, and he talked on and on about how he needed to have a spotless online record. And he used that word again and again, spotless. So I've got to be spotless. And he was first told that in 8th grade when he was running for student body president of 8th grade. And I thought, wow, okay. So now I want to mention the humanity of Snapchat. Many of you may know Snapchat. Maybe you're on Snapchat. You may not know what Snapchat is. Snapchat is this app. It's already kind of waning in popularity, but it's still pretty popular. But I definitely saw the rise, like the burst of popularity of Snapchat. And Snapchat is this app where, you can take a picture of yourself, basically send like a visual text, and then it disappears in 10 seconds. That's the basics. And then, of course, people think of it as the sexting app because it disappears in 10 seconds, the picture. And then we've had a lot of newspaper articles about how, but people can take screenshots, so be careful. And so students are all aware that, you're playing with fire if you sext on Snapchat. But they're all aware of the screenshot. But the reason why I'm bringing it up is because of what I mentioned before about the importance of appearing happy at all times. So the humanity of Snapchat is that whatever you put on there disappears for the most part, unless in remote instances where someone is out to get you. So in general, it disappears. And students love the disappearing act because they feel like it's one of the only spaces where they can just be silly, and they can just be dorky, and they can say, I'm having a bad day, and make a frown, and take a picture and send it to their friends, because then it disappears. There's no evidence of it, at least in theory, and they are really longing for a space to be honest, to be who they really are. And so, students, when I would ask them about Facebook and Instagram, there's so much pressure with all the likes, but they all brightened up when I asked about Snapchat. And they were like, oh, Snapchat is so much fun. So it's almost like their playground. It's like their online playground, I would say. Which brings me to the fact that college students are craving anonymity online because of all this pressure to appear perfect with anything attached to their name. So if it's attached to your name, you are responsible for it maybe for the rest of your life. And so there is no playing around with Facebook. People know that everybody's going to look at your Facebook page, so you better be careful. And so I think in many ways, the popularity of Snapchat comes from this longing to just be able to say whatever you want or just to be goofy for a while. And along with Snapchat, there are a number of other apps that have arisen in huge popularity, one in which I literally have seen the rise of since it didn't exist in the spring semester, but in September it did. And it's called Yik Yak. And it's basically, it pulls your GPS location. So each college campus has a Yik Yak. And so you have to be like within a 2-mile radius. And so basically like everybody on a college campus can be on the, say like the Notre Dame Yik Yak. And it's anonymous. So it's a kind of anonymous Twitter, and it's like whatever's going on that campus. And this is not to say that it's all nice and silly. A lot of the students, what they love about it is how mean everybody is and how honest they are. It's the place where you say the things that are really not politically correct. It's where you really actually talk about what you believe and how you feel, and then people upvote it and downvote it, and then it disappears from the feed, and then it's gone. Or you do things like, I remember a student who was like, there are sometimes people are just like, today I'm just like sitting up in a tree and singing, isn't that nice? So they get to be goofy on that as well. And so, one of the things that the popularity of these anonymous kinds of Twitter or the texting, the pictures that disappear, I think really tells us something about the pressure that students feel about the public nature of online social media, of how oppressive it can be, but then they innovate to find other ways to be themselves. So I wanted to point that out. I wanted to mention religion here. I asked all the students, like any student who identified as particularly religious at the beginning of the interview, I asked them at some point, so do you ever post about your faith online? Do you use social media, as a forum for, talking about your beliefs? And pretty much most students, so Catholic students would always be like, no, it's not appropriate, to talk about your religion in public, which I feel like is very Catholic. But evangelical students were, they always talked about it's very important to post inspiring Bible verses. So they felt very open they felt very okay to be open about their faith. And I wanted to mention two young people in particular that I interviewed on this issue. I could go on and on about the religion thing, but that's another conversation. But two people in particular. So one young woman at an evangelical college campus, when I asked her about her faith and social media, she said, well, God uses Facebook. And I said, what? Like, does God have a profile? Like, what does that mean? And she said, God uses Facebook to glorify God's self. All social media is a tool for God's glory, and God is working through us to glorify God's self on social media. And we had a long discussion about that, which was interesting. And nearly like 2 students later on that same campus, I had a young man who told me that Facebook, things like Facebook and Twitter were false idols. That that social media, people were so engaged in it, they interacted with it as if it was its own God, and that it got in the way of people's faith. So he tried to distance himself from it on behalf of his faith. So I thought that I would close these particular remarks with just asking this question of, what does social media mean in our search for the human face, as you put it? So a fundamental aspect of our humanity seems to be our inability to be perfect. To be human is to be imperfect, right? Yet young adults today find themselves living, at least partially, in a world where they are now being taught that they should appear perfect, that they should only appear happy if they want a job, if they care at all about their futures, because online is forever, it's eternal. And every post you make is immortal, godlike. It lives on and on, even beyond you. And that's a pretty tall order to live with all the time.
Great, thank you, Donna. So, I'm a sociologist, and we sociologists specialize in generalizations. So I'm going to try to take a lot of specific particulars of observations and experience and try to generalize a little bit about some of the processes or causal mechanisms that may be going on with social media and human relationships and sense of self, just to sort of lay out on the table a number of arguments or possibilities that a lot of which you'll be familiar with, but just sort of systematically lay out so they're on the table so that we can then sort of directly wrestle with them or talk about them or refute them or whatever. And I have about 8 distinct possibilities, and I'm not going to elaborate them very much at all. But the first, and so the question is, what is it that about social media might be concerning? What is it that does concern some people, those that are more apocalyptic about it? What do they think is threatening? And so I just want to name those things, and then we can sort of think about them and talk about them. The first thing I think that I hear people are concerned about is that there's a thinning out, so to speak, of a kind of relationships, that there's a superficialization, so to speak, of relationships that goes on with an overuse of social media, meaning that the thin communities of social media friends may divert time and attention from the building of more direct, unmediated, face-to-face and embodied relationships. That people are worried that there's less of a sense of real people sitting with each other, working out real relationships, that the distance is a problem somehow. And I should say, I'm laying these things out not because I'm endorsing them and asking you to rally behind them against them. I have mixed feelings about them, but I'm just trying to lay them out as ideas. This idea of a thinning of relationships reminds me of a quote that back in the 19th century, Karl Marx said about modernity, that in modernity, all that is solid melts into air. And one wonders if there's something about social media that the solidity of face-to-face, real concrete relationships somehow increasingly is melting into air. There's a cartoon I use to try to convince my students to stop using social media during class. And you try to appeal to a sense of humor, but the cartoon is a man and a woman in bed with no clothes on, sitting next to each other, and it appears that they probably had just had sexual intercourse, except they're both on iPhones, and the guy is saying, "That was the best text I ever had." So, the sense of like, wait a minute, why are you on your iPhone here? So that's the first idea. The second is, and this resonates a lot with what Donna said, there seems to be a concern that obsession with appearance and perceptions is distorting people's sense of what matters. That it's not so I lived in North Carolina for a long time, and the North Carolina state motto was to be rather than to appear. And the worry is that something in social media increasingly emphasizes appearance and perceptions, the public presentation of self, not the real selves that we are, and that somehow that would be distorting of human identity and experience. A third mechanism or process that may be going on is the increased mediation of experience. And by this I mean that social media seem to create new layers of mediation, like layers of distance between the real phenomenological human experience and what's going on in the world and in human relationships. So much of reality already has become mediated to us through media images. Very many things come to us through images. And the digital revolution seems to accentuate and accelerate that so that more and more of life is mediated rather than directly experienced. Another concern is the corruption of civil, reasoned public discourse. And in this kind of pluralistic democratic society, people have differences need to be able to talk together about them, get along, and come up with policies and agreements that will seem to work. And the concern is that social media just invites people to be their worst selves. It invites them to be snarky, impersonal, destructive in their exchanges online, and that this is not good for interpersonal relationships, clearly, but also for the common good, the health of civil society. Another concern is that social media contribute to a kind of an epistemic, individualistic subjectivism, and all that I mean by that is there's no authority out there I can really rely on. All I have is my sense of things, my personal, subjective, individual sense. And that this could come about, for example, by the fact that the internet wipes out pretty much gatekeepers. You don't have Walter Cronkite telling you what's happening in the world. You don't have a book editor that tells you, here's a book worth reading, don't read other books. You can search, everything's available, everything can dump into your lap, and then it's up to the individual to decide what they think, how they feel. And so the idea there, it may be actually changing the way our brains think about who's reliable, what you can trust, that puts the reliability of the authority back on each individual self, and all they have to go on is their own subjectivity. Another concern has to do with a distraction with trivia, that when people take so many photos of their hamburger or their kitten or whatever and just post, or the latest feeling or whatever happened this afternoon, that's focusing human attention on the immediate, most of which is trivial, rather than the long-term, weightier, consequential, big questions and relationships in life. Another concern that people have to do with contracting attention spans, and again, whether this is grumpy old men conservatives who are just being grumpy or not. I know college professors who've been around a long time that say young people's brains have been formed in a way where they no longer know how to read, think through, and criticize a long and difficult text, which is what has traditionally happened in much of liberal arts education, because most texts that young people have had to deal with in their lives are short, quick. They don't even have to have proper grammar in them necessarily. And so it's not just a matter of what kind of relationships do I have, it's a matter of how am I learning what's an appropriate way to engage ideas. And have I learned a kind of an attention span that can work through long, difficult, complicated things? Again, if that's true, and I'm not necessarily endorsing it, but if that's true, that has real consequences for the nature of personal experience, the nature of engaging the world, and the nature of being part of a society and a world that's extremely complicated and it requires ongoing argumentation and working through problems. Another thing from an Abrahamic point of view, at least, and I would say a human goods point of view, is there's a concern that social media are in some ways eliminating what traditionally might have been called Sabbath. That is, you have a time in your life when things just get put down or stop being paid attention to or get turned off or you just rest. And the 24/7 nature of social media seems to eliminate boundaries and schedules. Everything is available all the time. And the question is, again, what does that do to our sense of ourself and our experience in the world? And finally, there is some concern that social media, and we'd have to think through how this works, but somehow social media erode a commitment to social institutions, to real social institutions out in the world, to care about them, to invest in them, to build them, to uphold them and sustain them. That something about social media is radically privatizing, I'll just choose what I want to do and exclude the things that I don't care about. And so, I know people that really are very concerned that young people just are not invested in social institutions in a way that's necessary for a good society to carry on. So these are some of the ways that we might think, should we be troubled by social media? Or should we be worried? Is this harmful? Again, I'm kind of ambivalent about it all. So, having said that, now I want to bounce a question back to Donna that I thought of when she was speaking, and I want to set up my question by relating something that I've heard people in colleges who work with study abroad students have reported, and that is many college study abroad students come back from studying abroad reporting that when they got to their study abroad site that was offline, the first week they were completely miserable because they couldn't be checking everything all the time. They didn't know how they were going to live. And after 1 week, the rest of the semester, they had a wonderful time, felt completely liberated, and thought life was was fantastic. And then when their study abroad was over, then they had to had a depressing re-entry time of sort of like, oh, I need to get all back into this world of 24/7 social media. So with that in mind, and that seems to be telling of something. So my question for you, Donna, is there seems to be a dual nature going on here between an attraction to, an interest in, really getting something out of social media, and almost a dependence on, but also an alienation from, something that's oppressive about it, that's really wished it wasn't the way it was, and a feeling of powerlessness to do anything about it. Do you have any thoughts about the sort of the paradox of feeling oppressed or alienated, but also attracted to and really enjoying this experience?
I have data on that.
Okay.
So though I haven't counted up everything, so I'm just going to give you general numbers. But one of the things that I didn't know when I did my very, very first interviews, I didn't have a segment of questions on smartphones. And the first 3 interviews, I said at least every single one of those students, the first 3 that I interviewed, just brought up smartphones on their own and the role of smartphones in life and how it affects your social, how you socialize or don't. And I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, how did I miss that whole category? I've got to have a whole category of questions just on their relationship to their smartphones. And one of the things, and I'm thinking about smartphones because of what you mentioned about the study abroad experience. And I had so many students who, unprompted from me, said something like, oh my gosh, I went and I did spring break in India or something. I went to India and my smartphone didn't work there. I didn't have any service at all. And it was so amazing not to be on my phone all the time. And everybody I was with, they weren't on their phones either. And we talked to each other way more. And the friends I made on that trip were way better than the ones I had before. And I had this one young woman in particular, she was total surfer girl, and she was always swimming, and she told me, she was like, oh my gosh, I was leaning over the seawall one day with my phone, and then I dropped it into the water, and she was like, and I was like, oh no, this is so horrible. She was so expressive. And she goes, so I spent the whole day without my phone, and she was like, by the end of the day, it was like I came up out of a fog, and everything was so clear. I almost didn't want to get it fixed. And so many students had stories like that of how strange and wonderful it was to live without their smartphones and to not be able to just access. That said, I asked them, if a student said something like that, I said, well, so have you thought about getting rid of your smartphone? If life is so much better. Well, no, because it's like an obligation to have one today, because my parents need to reach me 24/7. People need to reach me 24/7. So students feel like it's an obligation to be reachable 24/7 now. And they also feel like, but they talked about the burden. I learned that I needed to ask the question, so do you ever feel like your smartphone is like a job? Because so many students talk about the burden of responding to often 300 texts a day, how they feel like their to-do lists are so overwhelming. But at the same time, they also feel like you're not allowed to live anymore without this stuff. And many of them talked about how even if they didn't want to be on social media, they felt like it was really important to their future careers to have a profile because, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. If people search you and they can't find anything, they think something's wrong with you. But then if they search you and they find, you with the drinking beer, then something's also wrong with you. And so you've got to be searchable enough, but you can't, when you are searchable, you've got to have a very particular profile. And so I spend so much time talking to these students about the different ways that they try to curb their usage. They come up with all of these tricks, and they have all kinds of rituals. A lot of students, I had a number of students who said, the way they dealt with this, their impulse to check, and if that frustrated them, was they would leave the house in the morning without their charger, and once the phone ran out, they had to let it go. And so they have all these tricks, and one of the things I think is maybe interesting for all of us here to think about at this particular conference is, because I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, is, so let's take the Catholic tradition. Don't wire your churches, okay? So students are looking for oases where they don't have Wi-Fi because that helps them. And I often think, boy, did we make a mistake to have every nook and cranny of our campuses wired, because students they feel like they don't have the willpower to resist. The only way they can is if they're in India and they don't have service. And so I do feel like we need to have oases where they can access the internet. And they talk about, students at Catholic schools, sometimes they'll talk about going on retreats and how they went on a wireless retreat. They had to set the cell phone aside. And one of the things that I think is really useful about the Catholic tradition, for example, are these practices or these rituals or these spaces that we have in our life, once a week or once a year, if you go on a retreat, where we have to unplug. And so I hope you all can think about that. Students are looking for ways to ritualize their unplugging. They're looking for help unplugging, maybe not always, but at least sometimes. And students talked about how hard it was, the ones who went to church, to not do Snapchat in church. I was like, you're doing Snapchat in church? So like you're taking selfies of yourself in the middle of church? But a lot of them talk about, my rule is I can't be online in church. And they really cherish, like sometimes like Mass, just the opportunity once a week to have an hour where they're not online and they're expected not to be online is really huge for them. So I think we all need to really reckon with that. I'm sure this place is wired too. I haven't tried it.
Yeah, one theme that I want to come across here that I always say when I'm talking about my own research on youth is that I think it's really important, even though both of us study youth and a lot of the focus on social media is on youth, I think it's very, very important for those of us who are older to acknowledge that this is not a standard, kids these days problem. This is embedded in the adult world, the adult capitalist society and institutions, that the children are being raised a certain way by certain kind of people with certain kind of institutions that they're being socialized into. They're particularly adept at using it and doing creative things with it, but it would be a huge mistake to fall into the, kids these days, as if adults are not implicated, if not fully dragged down into all this stuff. This last summer I went to Mass in Brooklyn, and a 150-some-year-old woman got a cell phone call in the middle of the Mass and stood up and had the conversation right there. So that's not, and there were other people appalled, but so she's not typical, but it's not just kids. It's whatever is going on with young people, I think, is a good barometer of what's going on in our larger culture and society. So just to bracket that, to keep in mind.
Well, on the subject you mentioned of the thinning of relationships, I think everyone gets really worried that young adults are not going to know how to conduct relationships. They're not meeting each other face to face now because of social media. And what I found out was really the opposite, which shocked me. And what I found out from college students was they all think adults are nuts because they do online dating. And they think that's crazy, that they'll just meet someone online and then go have sex or whatever, meet their partner online. And that is just a world away for them. In general, they all want to meet people face to face. And one of the things I think about with people are always talking about online learning and all of that. That's great, and even like online universities. But I can tell you that students cherish the fact that college, a residential college or just being in classes with other people is a way for them to meet face to face. They want to meet each other face to face. They want to meet their friends face to face. They want to meet them on their football team and their cross country team and in the band and whatever else the activities that they do. And so the idea that they would develop relationships the relationships would start online is pretty horrifying to them, even if they may use social media as a tool in forwarding that relationship or in keeping in touch with someone. But in general, they all feel like it cannot be the substance of my relationship. It can be a tool in it, but it's not central.
So one question that I have for myself, and I'd be interested in hearing what you think, is sort of, again, it gets back to the why, the powerful compulsion or attraction to this close relationship with social media. And I could think of different things. I mean, one argument is simply human beings, like as the presentation yesterday afternoon, humans like other primates are incredibly hyper-social animals. We're just incredibly social, so give us any ways to be social. And except for those introverts among us, we'll be incredibly social all the time, and this just reflects a hypersociality, and people are just doing it. It's not displacing their face-to-face relationships, they're just adding on to it other ways to be social. That's a pretty benign view of things. Another possibility is that there's some deep, profound insecurity in us as human beings in our spiritual condition, that we're just not okay with solitude and silence, that they're trying to fill that up. And that argument goes all the way back to Walkmen, from the 80s or whatever with earphones, but that we can't stand silence, that we're trying to almost escape something with noise and interaction and trivia. And if that's true, that would be really good to know. And whatever these things are true, you would think would have implications. You were just talking about getting offline almost as a new spiritual discipline is something to be thinking about. From an Augustinian perspective, you could think, well, maybe people are searching for God in the looking for otherness and the trying to find so many relationships, that there's some search for the good here that may be misdirected or distorted or incomplete somehow. I just really think it behooves us to try to dig deeper. What itches do social media scratch for people of all ages? Because it's clearly a powerful thing that people are locked into and attached to. And the more we can understand, what is that attachment? What part of the brain is lighting up, so to speak, and why? And what does that reflect about our condition or our situation in the world? That's the kind of question I think we really need to be asking.
I think one of the things that surprised me most, or that was most interesting about doing this work and all these interviews, is just how deeply, at least the college students that I spoke with, are thinking about social media and how it's affecting who they are, their relationships, et cetera. And one of the things that really stunned me was at the very end of the interview, I asked every single student, is there anything that we haven't talked about yet, with regard to social media that's particularly fascinating to you or interesting to you, that worries you? And I just left it open. And I had a number of students who said, I really worried about our inability to be alone today. We're never alone anymore. And I had a bunch of students who talked about their inability to just be still, their inability to be alone. And I thought, And students, I'm sure you've heard this. They talk about how, pulling out the smartphone is like the new yawn. And, it's a way to sort of like cut the conversation or show you're not interested. And it's the cover up for all awkward moments. And so students talked a lot about how I worry that we're not learning to get through those awkward moments, that we're leaning on our smartphones too much, to sort of cover up our inability or our fears of communicating with each other, our fears of looking our friends in the eyes when we're talking. And so I was really amazed by how deeply students are thinking about how it's affecting who they are, what they do, how they interact with others, their capacities, their struggles. And so I guess one of the things I would, for those of you who are coming from, religious communities today, I think probably most of you are, I would encourage you as communities to think about what are the ways in which you can not just use social media as a tool in your communities, but figure out ways to bracket social media in the community that you create. Because I can tell you that you'll be doing a service, certainly to the young people in your community, but I think probably, like Chris had said before, like we all struggle with these things. We all have that impulse to grab our phone, and I think probably many of us are thinking much like, maybe we're not so far away from the young people in our communities as we might imagine.
Well, Donna and I would love to have had a Q&A hour following up here to really hear all your thoughts, because obviously you all been wrestling with this stuff and thinking about it, and no doubt have a lot of great questions and ideas, but the format of the program doesn't allow for that. So it's really our hope that by just laying out these ideas here, that this session will have stimulated your thinking, giving you more ideas to chew on, and that we'll just continue to carry on a conversation the rest of today, the weekend, as you go home in your own minds with the kids you work with or have in your school, wherever, your parish. So
thank you.
Carry on the conversation. Thank you very much.